Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Nuria got lucky to have such a mother-in-law. Her close friend Irasema told her countless stories, saying that her husband's mother made her life unbearable. Irasema referred to her mother-in-law as a snake. Nuria listened to her friend's tales, wide-eyed and shocked, only able to sigh in disbelief. "Oh, goodness!" Nuria exclaimed. "Yeah," Irasema recounted, her eyes wide with indignation. "She started coming over unannounced as a surprise. The moment she crosses the threshold, she goes straight to the rooms and checks if they're clean with a white napkin under the bed. If there's even a speck of dust, she runs to me and points her finger under my nose, shouting, 'Filth.' If she finds a speck on the carpet, she brings it to me as if I haven't vacuumed in a year." "That can't be," Nuria said, shaking her head. "And that's not all," Irasema continued, then she rushes to the kitchen to check everything. She opens the fridge and triumphantly yells, "This yogurt expires tomorrow. Are you trying to poison my son with expired food? And for how many days has this soup been sitting here? Did you cook it yesterday? You've lost your mind. Vasco should only eat fresh food." Irasema imitated her mother-in-law with a shrill voice, and despite the horrifying situation, it was impossible not to burst into laughter. Then she goes to the bathroom and toilet. Is the toilet sparkling? Is the towel pure white? Is the washing machine not overflowing? Then she checks how Vasco's shirts are arranged in the closet. Are they ironed well enough? If not, according to her authoritative opinion, she starts yelling at me. What a nightmare, Nuria sighed, but secretly she was grateful that she got lucky with her husband's mother. Even in her worst nightmares, she couldn't imagine Toya Hidalgo raising her voice or saying anything remotely rude. Her mother-in-law had always been remarkably delicate and tactful, not even pushing for grandchildren, although Nuria's own mother frequently brought up the topic. "Nuria, when are you going to have children? The time has come. I want to have an opportunity to spend time with them." During family gatherings, numerous aunts, cousins, and others also pressured Nuria without holding back their expressions. "Nuria, what's wrong with you? When are you going to get pregnant? You're not getting any younger. How old are you? 27? Well, my dear. At your age, I was already giving birth to my third child, and in the maternity ward, I was the oldest among everyone. They called me the old-timer." Nuria forced a strained smile and mumbled something incomprehensible in response. Questions about when she and her husband would start a family were agonizing for her. It had been 5 years since their wedding, and they still didn't have children, not because they didn't want them, but simply because it wasn't happening. The merciless pregnancy tests always showed a single line. In the first year after their wedding, Nuria and Bruno didn't think much about having children. However, when they finally decided it was time, it turned out that it wasn't as easy as snapping their fingers. Every month, Nuria prayed for a positive outcome, but the only thing she got was the consistent disappointment. Friends, acquaintances, and colleagues who had already become parents bombarded her with well-meaning advice and tried-and-true folk methods to conceive quickly. She brewed herbal teas, stood in birch tree poses, and took some Indian Ayurvedic tablets, but nothing seemed to help. After a year of unsuccessful attempts, Nuria finally surrendered and sought the help of medical professionals. She thought that now everything would surely be sorted out, that she would be prescribed vitamins or injections, and that she would instantly become pregnant. After all, why should she have trouble conceiving? Her cycle was as regular as clockwork, she had never had an abortion, and she had never contracted any sexually transmitted diseases. Perhaps it was just stress and a simple vitamin deficiency. However, after numerous tests and examinations, she was diagnosed with a rather serious condition that made natural conception impossible, even with assisted reproductive technologies. It required lengthy and, at times, painful treatment. Months of unbearable waiting followed again. Tears, hopes, and each time her heart shattered into thousands of pieces, which Nuria desperately was trying to glue back together, repeatedly patching it until she was exhausted and simply drained. 2 options remained, surrogacy or adoption, but Nuria didn't want to hear about them. At the same time, she dreaded that Bruno would leave her, that someday she would become a burden to him, and that he would seriously desire a child of his own with another healthy woman. Her husband assured her that he loved her more than life itself, and whether they had children or not was irrelevant. Still, Nuria couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy. She kept her problems and anxieties to herself, not sharing them with friends, family, or even her mother. Most of all, Nuria despised it when people pitied her. She learned to brush aside tactless questions and ignore them. If someone was particularly persistent, she calmly stated that she was child-free, letting many shake their heads in confusion, but at least there was no humiliating sympathy in their eyes, which Nuria feared so much. Among all these overly curious individuals, Toya, Nuria's mother-in-law, was a model of delicacy and unobtrusiveness. She always asked Nuria about her well-being but never invaded her privacy or allowed herself any inappropriate comments, unsolicited advice, or uncomfortable questions. Nuria endlessly respected, valued, and even loved her mother-in-law for this. She hadn't encountered a more benevolent and decent person, and it seemed that Toya returned her the favor, referring to Nuria as her own daughter, always caring for her as much as for her own son. Nuria learned about her mother-in-law's serious illness entirely by accident. Toya kept it hidden from everyone, even Bruno. When the son and daughter-in-law visited her, she unfailingly greeted them with a warm smile and a table laden with food. However, in the last month, Nuria began to notice that, although her mother-in-law still set the table as before, she looked very tired each time, almost exhausted, as if cooking sapped all her strength. Toya, Nuria said, "You don't have to strain yourself for us. You get tired of standing by the stove for half a day. There's no need for such sacrifices. Next time, we'll buy something ourselves, and that's enough." Her mother-in-law smiled with pale lips. "Oh, Nuria, dear, I feel perfectly fine. It's a joy for me to treat you and Bruno to something delicious." Nuria frowned. "I can see that you look tired, weak, and a bit pale, and there are dark circles under your eyes. You need more rest." "I'll rest in due time," Toya waved off. "I'm just so glad that you haven't forgotten me and come to visit. Let me take care of you a little, my dear." Bruno himself began to suspect that something was amiss with his mother. "Mom seems to have lost a lot of weight. She became thin." He shared his observations with Nuria. She became concerned. "I noticed it too. Yet, she insists that everything is fine. She looks exhausted and unhealthy." "That's Mom. She's always like this," Bruno sighed. "She never admits when she's feeling unwell or if something hurts. Maybe she should have a medical checkup?" Nuria suggested. "Check her blood, heart, and other internal organs. Just to be on the safe side." Bruno frowned. "Do you think there's something serious?" Nuria shook her head. "No, but just in case. Or maybe she's just tired. We should buy her a vacation by the sea. She hasn't gone anywhere to have a rest for so long," Bruno suggested. "That's a good idea," Nuria nodded. However, Toya resisted when she got to know about the idea of going to the south and weakly argued. "Why? The whole household depends on me, the garden, the chickens, and the rabbits. Who will take care of them in my absence?" "Don't worry, we'll look after your garden and animals," Bruno waved his hand. "When I stop by after work, and if needed, Nuria and the neighbor can help." Toya's neighbor was a kind 20-year-old girl, Natalya, an orphan who had been raised by her grandparents after her parents tragically died. However, it had been a year since the elderly couple passed away, leaving Natalya all alone. Fortunately, she inherited their house, and from morning till night, Natalya busied herself with household chores, occasionally stopping by Toya's to help with something or simply chat as neighbors do. Natalya earned a living by sewing at home, not much, but it was enough for her solitary life, especially since the garden and livestock provided her with decent sustenance. Of course, Natalya won't refuse to help. Upon hearing about the neighbor, Toya brightened up. "I'll talk to her, probably. If she agrees, fine, I'll go to your sea." Honestly, Nuria didn't particularly like this neighbor of her mother-in-law. She reminded her of cunning characters from movies. The girl even spoke similarly, in a high-pitched voice with a meek and shy smile, behaving like an obedient little lamb. But deep down, Nuria understood that what irritated her the most about the neighbor was not her modesty or doll-like face with clear submissive eyes. Nuria suspected that Natalya had long been hopelessly in love with Bruno, her husband. Once, she shared her suspicions with him, but her husband just snorted mockingly. "Who? Natalya? Come on, what are you talking about? I remember her as a kid. She always tagged along when I hung out with the guys and asked them to join us for a swim in the river, a walk in the woods, or a night out. She's 7 years younger than me. I never saw her as a woman, more like a little sister." Nuria pressed her lips together and didn't say anything, but she thought to herself that childhood was long over and Natalya was no longer a kid but a quite attractive adult. However, Nuria had no reason not to trust her own husband. If he said he didn't see Natalya as a woman, then so be it. Toya returned from her seaside vacation very pleased. Nuria and Bruno called her constantly, and she enthusiastically shared her impressions: the turquoise and transparent sea in the mornings, how gentle and warm it was, how delicious grapes were ripe from the vine, how juicy and ripe peaches were, the beautiful shells washed ashore by the waves, and once a real live dolphin swam to the beach, close up. Toya watched in awe as it played and danced in the water, either playing or hunting for fish. "It seems your mom benefited from the trip," Nuria remarked with a smile. Even through video calls, I noticed that her face was literally glowing with happiness. "She looks refreshed and beautiful." "Well, I told you everything would be fine. She just needed a good rest," Bruno confirmed contentedly. The day before her mother-in-law's arrival, Nuria decided to do a thorough cleaning of her house. Toya didn't ask for it, but it's much more pleasant to return to a clean home. However, when she opened the door with the spare set of keys, she found that everything inside was already cleaned, not just cleaned, but literally shining with cleanliness: freshly washed floor cloths, a sparkling clean floor, not a speck of dust on the furniture surfaces, all the dishes in the kitchen gleaming, the starched tablecloth literally crackling, and the bed linen, pure white, ironed, smelling of conditioner. Who put things in order here? Nuria thought with surprise and immediately answered herself out loud. Well, who else but our meek Natalya caretaker? And, although theoretically she should have felt grateful to the girl, Nuria felt a slight irritation. Why is she trying so hard? As if she wants to please Toya, she thought with annoyance. Bruno is already taken, after all. Does Natalya still harbor illusions about him, hoping that one day he'll turn his male attention to her? Nuria went out to the yard and checked on the chickens and rabbits. Everything was in order. The birds were fed and watered, the rabbit cages were cleaned, and fresh succulent grass poked out from them. In the garden, everything was also in perfect order. There was not a single weed, and the beds were watered. Against her will, Nuria felt a surge of dull irritation again. Look at how diligent Natalya is, truly a fairy tale heroine, Nuria said, subconsciously not trusting the girl, as behind the meek gaze of her huge blue eyes, she imagined a sly squint. However, she thanked her for the help anyway. But Nuria's husband, she thought, shouldn't even have caught Natalya's eye. He's not her type. Besides, he didn't cheat on his wife, he loved only Nuria. Nuria and Bruno went together to the airport to welcome Toya, and now they were attentively searching the crowd of arrivals for the familiar, slender figure. There she is, exclaimed Nuria joyfully, the first to notice Toya, and she waved to her. The woman headed towards them, smiling and dragging her small suitcase on wheels. Bruno and Nuria rushed to her to hug and kiss. And then something terrible happened. Right before their eyes, their mother suddenly made a choked sound and paled, the paleness even showing through her fresh tan. Before Bruno and Nuria could react, Toya began to slowly sink to the ground, like a lifeless rag doll. Bruno rushed to his mother and managed to catch her just before the inevitable fall. Meanwhile, Nuria, looking around, shouted piercingly, "A doctor, we need a doctor, someone is unwell here." They revived the mother-in-law in the airport's medical center and then, waiting for an ambulance, sent her to the hospital. What's wrong with her? Is it dangerous? Why did she lose consciousness? Bruno bombarded everyone with anxious questions. But they diplomatically responded. It's hard to draw conclusions right now. We need to conduct a full examination, take tests, and perform a thorough examination. Bruno, I'm fine, his mother reassured him weakly, lying on the stretcher. It's just fatigue, a change in climate, my head was spinning, it will pass. Take me home, please. No way, Nuria and Bruno objected in unison. You won't go home until we know for sure what's happening with you. A series of endless tests and examinations followed. Deep down, Nuria was afraid that it was something serious, but she didn't admit it to Bruno to avoid unnecessary worry. However, the diagnosis still hit them both like a thunderbolt out of a clear sky. I'm very sorry, the doctor said, addressing Bruno, your mother has cancer. Cancer? He asked in bewilderment, squeezing Nuria's hand tighter, as if seeking protection. Mom has cancer? It means she'll die. Come on, Bruno, why are you saying such things? Scolded Nuria, herself shocked no less than her husband. Cancer is not a death sentence. Right? She turned to the doctor for support. He shrugged uncertainly, seemingly reluctant to give false hope, but not inclined to needlessly frighten them either. There are always chances, he evasively replied. The good news is that the stage is not too advanced. We can recommend an immediate operation, followed by a course of chemotherapy. Will that help? Bruno asked hopefully. The doctor averted his gaze. I assure you, we will do everything possible, but unfortunately, it doesn't always depend on us. Okay, Bruno decisively shook his head. We should do the operation as soon as possible, please don't delay it. Then he turned his bewildered, scared, childlike gaze to his wife, seeking support. Maybe we shouldn't tell Mom what's wrong with her, he suggested. At least until after the chemotherapy. Let her think she just needs an operation, but not a word about it being cancer. Yes, maybe that will help her maintain a more positive attitude, Nuria nodded and looked at the doctor. Can you refrain from telling Toya about her diagnosis for now? The doctor frowned, but then nodded discreetly. Well, it's possible that this will indeed help her undergo the operation better and worry less. Nuria suddenly realized. Perhaps we should stop by Toya's home and bring some things for the hospital, like clothes, a robe, slippers, toiletries, a comb, and the rest. Yes, of course, Bruno nodded. Let's go right away. You'll help me gather everything so I don't forget anything. At Toya's home, Nuria quickly found the needed items and packed them into a bag. Meanwhile, her husband was sitting on a stool in the kitchen, staring blankly at the wall. I can't believe Mom could die, Nuria, he finally said. His lips trembled, like those of an offended child. I don't want her to die. Nuria rushed to her husband and hugged him tightly, pressing his head against her chest. She won't die, she whispered warmly and convincingly, covering his tear-warm cheeks with kisses. No, of course not, she won't die. They'll definitely help her. The operation will help. I believe in that. And her husband continued to tremble with silent sobs. I don't know how I'll be able to hide this from her. I feel like I'll just look at her face, and she'll immediately understand everything, he sobbed. Nuria was striking his hair like he was a little boy, comforting and consoling him. Nuria, he pleaded with her, raising his eyes to her. Could you take Mom's things yourself? I'm afraid that today I'm just not capable, I won't hold up, and I'll ruin everything. I can't look at her, knowing about her terrible diagnosis. I need some time to process everything. Of course, my love, Nuria nodded. I'll go to the hospital myself and give everything to Toya. You really need to calm down and gather yourself. Thank you, Nuria, he said, pressing her hands to his lips. What would I do without you? She picked up the bag of things and asked, Are you going home now? Bruno shook his head slowly. No, not home for now. I want to sit here for a while, with Mom alone, to think about everything. I need this, Nuria, just a little time alone to think everything over. Of course, she nodded gently. I understand. Stay here as long as you need. I'll go home right after the hospital, and I'll wait for you there. Call me if you need anything. If Nuria could have known what would happen at her mother-in-law's house after she left, she would never have left Bruno alone. Toya believed the hastily concocted story about a small, trivial operation. Don't worry, Nuria reassured her with an overly cheerful tone. They'll operate, and you'll be good as new. Here are your things for the first time, and then, if needed, I'll bring more. Where is Bruno? Toya asked in a weak voice. Oh, he was urgently called to work, Nuria lied. He sends you his best regards and promises to visit you tomorrow, for sure. Well, Toya said to herself. If I really had something serious, Bruno would be here now. So my health problems must be nonsense. Nuria felt awkward about deceiving this woman, who trusted her and didn't suspect anything bad, but she still managed to force a smile and nod encouragingly. You'll recover soon, Toya. And now try to rest and get some sleep. Tomorrow, Bruno and I will come and bring you something tasty. When Nuria arrived home, her husband was not there, probably still at his mother's house. She didn't bother him with calls, deciding that she would take care of preparing dinner. Also, she needed to cook something dietary and nutritious for her mother-in-law. In the hospital, of course, they also fed her, but home-cooked food couldn't compare with it. While Nuria was busy in the kitchen, washing, cleaning, and chopping vegetables and boiling chicken broth, time flew by imperceptibly, and the gloomy thoughts subsided on their own. However, evening came, dinner had long been ready, and Bruno still hadn't returned. Hesitating, Nuria sent him a message, "Where are you?" He didn't reply right away. "There, at Mom's house." "Should I wait for you for dinner?" He read the message, but this time Bruno was silent for a very, very long time. Finally, he texted, "I think no, I want to stay here with Mom. Have dinner and go to bed without me. I'll come late. Good night." Trying not to show how deeply upset she was, Nuria also wished him a good night and sighed. She had no appetite whatsoever. She couldn't sleep for a long time, as she felt terribly empty and cold without her husband. While waiting for Bruno and unsuccessfully trying to fall asleep, Nuria's thoughts kept returning to her mother-in-law's illness and the upcoming surgery. She sincerely cared about Toya and wished her a speedy recovery, but deep down, she feared the chances were slim. It was terrifying even to imagine what Bruno must have been feeling right now. After all, it was his mother. Sleep finally overcame her only towards morning. When pink rays of dawn timidly penetrated through the curtains, Nuria fell into blissful oblivion. She woke up only when she heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. She jumped out of bed as if scalded. Bruno came. But how much time has passed? Glancing at the clock, Nuria couldn't contain her astonished exclamation. Wow, it's already 8 in the morning, which means Bruno didn't spend the night at home at all. Hastily throwing on a silk robe, Nuria rushed to meet him and almost screamed in shock. Bruno smelled like alcohol from 2 meters away, and he could barely stay on his feet, swaying and clutching the walls. "Are you drunk?" Nuria asked, bewildered, although it was already obvious. She had never seen her husband in such a state and was now terribly bewildered. Avoiding eye contact with her, Bruno mumbled, "I'm sorry, Nuria. I don't know how it happened." And suddenly, he whimpered plaintively, sliding down the wall to the floor and covering his face with his hands. Nuria, with pity, stroked his tousled hair. "Did you drink because of Mom?" she asked with a trembling voice. Bruno shook his head. "I'm a scoundrel, I'm a jerk, Nuria. I don't deserve your forgiveness, I'm just a wretch, a real wretch. Why are you torturing yourself?" Nuria pressed his head against her chest. For a moment, it seemed as if her husband smelled like a different woman's perfume, but she immediately dismissed that thought. What nonsense was coming to her mind? Moreover, the stench of alcohol was so overpowering that distinguishing any other sense was impossible, even if she wanted to. So, probably, her imagination just played tricks on her. Your reaction is perfectly natural, and I understand it. You're worried about your mother, Nuria comforted him. You have nothing to apologize for. Bruno continued to sob so bitterly and inconsolably that Nuria's heart literally ached with sorrow. At that time, she still didn't know that the reason for his tears wasn't his mother's illness but something else. The operation on her mother-in-law was successful, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. However, Bruno, since the day he came home drunk, has imperceptibly changed. Nuria couldn't quite put her finger on what these changes were, but her husband became entirely different, occasionally acting like a stranger. It seemed like he was avoiding Nuria, trying not to meet her gaze, and if he did, he immediately guiltily looked away, as if he were ashamed of something in front of her. Finally, Nuria couldn't take it anymore. Why are you looking at me as if you're a guilty child or a mischievous cat? She exclaimed, throwing her hands up. Did something happen? Her husband darkened and grumbled. Nothing happened, everything is fine. Then why have you become so distant? Nuria asked in desperation. At times, I'm even afraid to approach you. You're making up nonsense, Bruno mumbled, turning away again. I'm the same as before, nothing has changed. However, Nuria knew that wasn't true. Well, since Bruno didn't see fit to share his feelings with her, she didn't pry into his soul, hoping that with time, everything would gradually fall into place and her beloved Bruno would return to his former self. However, the changes with her husband only worsened over time. Bruno became even more closed, gloomy, and uncommunicative. A deep wrinkle appeared between his eyebrows. He often seemed lost in thought, staring into space, and then his face would take on the expression of someone tormented by something horribly distressing. At some point, Nuria even feared that Bruno was also sick, like his mother, and cautiously broached the subject of his well-being. But in response to her concerns, her husband only snapped. I'm healthy, absolutely healthy. Don't make things up. She was even a little offended and shed a few tears. Bruno, of course, immediately came to his senses, pulled her towards him, buried his face in her hair, just like before, and mumbled hoarsely through clenched teeth. Forgive me, Nuria, I've completely tortured you. Again, he's asking for forgiveness, wondered Nuria. What is weighing on him so much? Then she started noticing that Bruno was staying later after work. At first, she didn't pay much attention to it, especially since, upon returning home, her husband tersely reported. Went to see my mother. Nuria had no reason to suspect him of deceit. After all, these frequent, almost daily visits to his mother eventually began to worry her. She started to hallucinate again, thinking that Bruno smelled like someone else's perfume, and it certainly wasn't Toya's. Nuria didn't know what to think. Perhaps she was just winding herself up. Once, despising herself for it, Nuria dialed her mother-in-law's number, asked about her well-being and health, and then casually said, Toya, is Bruno still with you? Yes, her mother-in-law replied hesitantly. He's in the garden right now. I asked him to water the beds. Was he watering the beds at your place yesterday too? Nuria asked abruptly. And the day before yesterday, 3 days ago, and last week. Nuria, her mother-in-law became alarmed. What happened? Did Bruno offend you somehow? Nuria immediately cooled down, or rather, she felt like a balloon from which all the air had been released. No, she said. I'm sorry, Toya, I'm just a fool. Of course, Bruno didn't offend me, and, of course, I'm just glad that he's helping you. However, after hanging up, she pondered deeply. Maybe she should have gone to her mother-in-law's house herself and seen with her own eyes that everything was fine and that Bruno was indeed just helping his mother with household chores and didn't have an affair with another woman. Nuria convinced herself that she was going there only to visit Toya. But deep down, she knew that she actually wanted to make sure her husband wasn't deceiving her. But what did she plan to see at her mother-in-law's house? Did she hope to catch her husband with a lover? That was ridiculous. Bruno wouldn't bring a woman to his own mother's house, and Toya wouldn't cover for him. What nonsense! He wouldn't cheat on Nuria at all. Bruno was indeed at his mother's. Toya hadn't deceived her about that. At the house, Nuria encountered an idyllic scene. Toya, Bruno, and, as a surprise, neighbor Natalya were having coffee together. What's wrong with the fact that Natalya was there? She just dropped by as a neighbor. But at the sight of Nuria, all three seemed embarrassed, as if Nuria had become a witness to something indecent. Toya jumped up and bustled around her future daughter-in-law, as if trying to smooth over the awkwardness with lively chatter. Natalya lowered her head, pretending to be examining something at the bottom of her cup. And Bruno? At first, he turned pale, then blushed and sighed. What are you doing here? Just came to visit Toya, Nuria replied, feeling pathetic and lost. Do I still have the right to do that? Of course you do, Nuria, her mother-in-law exclaimed. This is your home, you know that perfectly well. However, at the moment, Nuria felt superfluous. What home? She felt like she was an uninvited and unwanted guest. Well, I think I'll go, Natalya muttered, getting up from the table. No one stopped her. As Natalya walked past Nuria, a familiar fragrance caught her attention. Could it be the same scent that has been lingering around Bruno lately? Well, you're kind of paranoid, Nuria scolded herself. Why would her husband get involved with that flirt? It was absurd. After Natalya left, the atmosphere became even more unbearable. All three, her mother-in-law, Bruno, and Nuria, felt awkward and constrained. Finally, after barely half an hour, Nuria hastily prepared to leave. Week followed week, month followed month. Her mother-in-law had another examination at the clinic, and now she needed to see doctors regularly to prevent a recurrence. Suddenly, out of the blue, it turned out that the illness had returned, or rather, it hadn't gone anywhere. It had just been dormant for a while and then struck with renewed force, affecting a different organ. It was painful to look at Bruno. Even Nuria struggled to hold back tears when she heard the doctor's verdict. This time, there's no hope. Prepare yourself. A couple of months, maybe 6 at most. The end is inevitable. The most challenging part was telling her mother-in-law about it, but as it turned out, she had already guessed. They couldn't do anything. At most, palliative therapy could alleviate suffering but not cure it. This shared tragedy seemed to bring Nuria and Bruno closer again. He sought support from her once more, tried to stay close, stopped lingering at work, and no longer disappeared in the evenings. Together, they surrounded the sick woman with care and attention, and they even hired a carer to be with her around the clock. The countdown was no longer in months but in days. Forgive me, Nuria, her mother-in-law said shortly before her death, her lips barely moving. Nuria didn't understand why she was asking for forgiveness. Unexpectedly, many people attended the funeral. Everyone in the village loved and respected Toya. Many spoke kind and warm words about the deceased. Many were genuinely crying. Strangely, Natalya didn't come. She was usually around Toya, but she didn't even come to the funeral. The wake was decided to be simple, right in the house, and everyone came not empty-handed. Someone brought a pie, someone brought pancakes, and someone else brought some other memorial treat. The mother-in-law looked at everyone gathered in the mourning frame on the photograph, and in the picture, she looked just like earlier, young, smiling, and beautiful. Nuria had the lump in her throat and, to hide her tears, slipped out of the room into the kitchen, even making up an excuse. She needed to replace the plates for one of the guests. In the kitchen, 2 gossipy neighbor women, Claudia and Nora, were chattering. Nuria didn't particularly like them for their penchant for gossip, but she couldn't just throw them out. After all, they came. They were true to form, busily murmuring in a corner near the stove. They didn't notice Nuria. Engaged in conversation, she involuntarily slowed her pace, eavesdropping. It seemed like she heard Bruno, her names, and the name of that meek Natalya. Thank God she had the decency not to attend the funeral, Nora loudly whispered. Can you believe what a snake Natalya turned out to be, pretending to be innocent and pure? Yes, Toya is to blame herself. She spoiled her and treated her too well, Claudia declared in an equally loud whisper. This quiet one has been hanging around Bruno since childhood, peeking into everything and batting her eyes. And Toya acted as if she didn't notice anything. Natalya was like a saint to her. On the other hand, you can understand Toya, Nora chimed in. She's been wanting grandchildren for a long time, but the daughter-in-law turned out to be an empty shell. Nuria felt the blood burn her cheeks. They were talking about her. Yes, unlucky indeed, Claudia clicked her tongue. God, forgive us. Nuria is a good girl, courteous and respectful, but she can't give birth. How long can a man endure such a woman? That's why Bruno couldn't take it anymore. Nuria pressed her palms against her burning cheeks. Bruno couldn't endure being with her. What nonsense! There he was, here in the room, sitting at the table, not going anywhere. He was with her, he was right there. Still, taking a man away from a living wife is the vilest thing, Nora spat indignantly. And how did that witch manage to pull it off? Bruno never paid any attention to her, and suddenly, he got involved with her. Oh, you never know with these types, Claudia lamented. She could have used some tricks on him or seduced him. These seemingly meek ones are actually shameless harlots. Oh, I had a feeling that behind that angelic Natalya face, there was a devil. Nuria was about to burst into the kitchen and sternly ask them about the topic of their conversation. Did Bruno cheat on her? And with whom? With Natalya? No, this was all nasty women's gossip. She couldn't believe such nonsense. But at the very moment when she was ready to announce her presence and put the gossiping neighbors in their place, she heard a phrase that made her freeze. And look, what a disaster. Nuria hasn't been able to get pregnant for a year, and this wretch got pregnant right away. Now they have twins. Nuria, in shock, covered her mouth with her hand, holding back a scream. Twins? Whose twins? Natalya's? Lovely ones they turned out to be, so nice, Nora sighed. They look just like their daddy, just like two peas in a pod. Yes, spitting images of Bruno, whether it's a daughter or a son, confirmed Claudia. It's clear why Toya softened. After all, grandchildren, no matter how you twist it, are closer and dearer than any golden daughter-in-law. Have you seen Bruno? The man is completely worn out, his face has darkened. Of course, he lost his mother, such grief. But he's also grim because of his illegitimate children. He loves his wife and can't abandon the kids either. He loves them too. After all, they're his blood relatives. Tears slowly rolled down Nuria's cheeks. She continued to stand, pressing her hand to her mouth, not wanting to reveal herself with an inadvertent scream or moan. How painful and sickening it was for her now. The truth that unfolded before her was horrifying. It was as if blinds had fallen from Nuria's eyes. She instantly understood the reason for her husband's frequent delays all these long months. Bruno was coldly deceiving her. All this time, he had a lover on the side, and not just any lover, but one who gave him what Nuria couldn't give, children. I wonder how old they are already. Nuria pondered, her thoughts muddled. And when did he start with Natalya? It seemed that the kids must still be babies. Nuria was sure that Bruno started cheating with Natalya only after learning about his mother's illness. That's when he changed, cooled towards his wife, and started disappearing in the evenings. Well, that meant his children were only a few months old now because they found out about the diagnosis of their mother-in-law a year ago. I wonder if he ever planned to tell Nuria about this or if he planned to lead a double life. Nuria suddenly realized that Bruno could leave her at any moment. She understood and choked on horror. What was keeping him with her? A sense of duty, friendship, and years of habit, but perhaps love had long since passed. And if he truly loved Nuria, he could never have been intimate with another woman under any circumstances. And now, there was even less holding him. In that other family, he had what mattered most, his little ones, a daughter and a son, spitting images of him, if you believed the gossip of the neighbors. It turned out that everyone knew everything. The thought of it filled Nuria with acute shame. Lord, what a disgrace. All the neighbors knew, they all saw how Bruno went to Natalya's place, and they all saw her with a belly and later with the children. And despite all this, these people looked Nuria in the eyes, smiled, greeted her warmly, asked how she was doing, and, secretly, they were probably gossiping about her and laughing. God, what a fool she had been, a blind, naive fool. Toya, her mother-in-law, may she rest in peace, she knew too, knew and kept silent, welcomed Nuria affectionately, acted as if nothing had happened, and all the while, she ran off to her son's lover to revel in the long-awaited grandchildren. The overwhelming amount of information literally crushed Nuria. She didn't know how she could return to the room and look people in the eye, especially her husband. It was unbearable. Did she deserve this? Hadn't she suffered enough? She didn't need all this gossip. She had become a laughingstock. Nuria abruptly entered the kitchen and noisily dropped the dirty plates into the sink, ignoring Claudia and Nora. They immediately straightened up and stopped whispering. Nuria, Claudia said, you must be tired, my dear. Sit down and take a break. I'll wash all the dishes myself. Yes, Nora chimed in. Relax, you've been through a lot today. Oh, yes, Nuria thought bitterly, I've been through a lot indeed. She suddenly realized that she couldn't stay in this house for another second. The walls were pressing on her, the atmosphere of the funeral, the shadow of her late mother-in-law, her husband's betrayal, and the all-knowing neighbors. She wanted to retreat to her burrow, hide from everyone, and cry and scream out her pain. For a moment, the thought flashed, go to Natalya's house, look that viper in the eyes, and also see Bruno's children. Were they really so similar to him, as the neighbors assured? But Nuria immediately got rid of that thought, afraid that when she looked into the faces of the little ones, her heart would shatter into a million pieces. She straightened her shoulders and entered the room where the funeral meal was still taking place. Bruno perked up at the sight of her. Nuria, where were you? He asked plaintively. Come here, sit with me. It's empty and cold without you. For a few moments, Nuria stared into his eyes, trying to understand how it was possible. How could one look into a wife's eyes, assure her that it was bad without her, and then, a few hours later, look into another woman's eyes, kiss her, hug her, and kiss the sweet-smelling heads of his children? She never suspected before that Bruno was such a terrible person. God, how she hated him at this moment. She wanted to claw at his face with her nails, scratch until blood, spit in his shameless eyes, and shout, "Why are you doing this to me?" Of course, Nuria didn't do any of that. She simply nodded coldly to him and gave a restrained smile. "Sorry, Bruno. I think I'll go home," she said evenly. "I'm terribly tired and drained. My head is pounding, and I want to take a pill and lie down in silence. Can you manage here without me?" "Sure," Bruno nodded awkwardly. "Of course, get some rest, don't worry about anything. If anything, the neighbors will help me clean up and wash everything." Especially one neighbor, Nuria thought with bitter irony, but she didn't say it out loud. Then, probably to further hurt herself, she added, "You can stay here tonight if you want." With your lover and children, she finished in her mind. Natalya would be happy. But her husband shook his head fearfully. No, what are you talking about? I don't want to stay here, I want to be with you. I'll definitely come back in the evening. You should have come back earlier, Nuria thought sarcastically. Now it's too late, it won't change or fix anything. Well, in any case, she still had time to be alone, to push herself together, and to think everything through. She needed to decide how to live. Back home, Nuria finally let her tears flow. They were rolling down her cheeks, unwilling to stop, and Nuria had been crying inconsolably for a whole hour. She felt like an object, unwanted, discarded, something her husband had used and discarded without remorse, replaced by something newer, although he hadn't discarded her yet. Bruno still maintained that they had a family. She knew it was all an illusion, all a lie. Nuria understood that Natalya wasn't a fool. She probably wouldn't openly tell Bruno to leave his wife and move in with her and the children permanently, but she also understood that sooner or later, Bruno would inevitably think about leaving. On one side of the scale was his wife, familiar, known to the smallest details, not too young, and also infertile. On the other side was a young, fresh, and beautiful mother of his children. Would any normal man choose to stay with the old, boring wife? Nuria knew that Bruno's departure would break her heart. But she also knew that it was unavoidable. After long, agonizing contemplation, she made a difficult but, as she believed, the only right decision. She had to free him and release his hands. Nuria wouldn't wait for him to leave her, she would just leave on her own. As soon as she made up her mind, Nuria hastily packed her things in a suitcase, throwing in whatever came to hand without discrimination. Then, she grabbed all her documents from the drawer. In a hurry, fearing to be caught off guard, Nuria quickly scribbled a farewell note to her husband. Before leaving the apartment where she had lived so many happy years together with Bruno, Nuria lingered at the threshold and looked back. Her chest tightened, and she had a lump in her throat. Taking a deep breath, Nuria pushed the door open. She had no idea where to go now, planning to spend the night in some hotel, and then, well, she'd see. Maybe she'd rent an apartment. She couldn't go to her parents or friends. Bruno would undoubtedly search for her there first, and she didn't want him to find her, at least not now. Her wound was still too fresh and burning for Nuria to look calmly into the eyes of her almost ex-husband. They would talk someday, and perhaps she would try to understand and forgive him, but not now. When Bruno finally returned home several hours later, an empty apartment awaited him with a note on the kitchen table. "I know everything about you, Natalya, and your children too. It's better for us to part ways, there is simply no other way. Please, Bruno, don't try to contact me. I'm not ready to see you yet. Don't torture yourself or me. I'll file for divorce myself, and you'll receive the notification. I sincerely wish you happiness in your new family. No longer yours, Nuria." 3 years later, Nuria was generally self-sufficient. She was rarely bored alone. She easily found activities she enjoyed, reading a book, taking walks, going to the theater or cinema, and having her favorite cappuccino in her favorite coffee shop. She didn't hesitate to do these things alone, although many of her friends admitted with embarrassment that they felt awkward going to public places without company. "If you go to the theater or a restaurant alone, people might think no one needs you," her colleague Ariel once told her. "What nonsense," protested Nuria. "That's absurd. I go alone because I'm not bored alone." "But people will think of it differently," Ariel shook her head. "It's shameful. Who cares whether I have company or not?" Nuria waved her hands indignantly. "Such outdated notions." "But these notions still work," Ariel insisted. "For example, if you go to a bar with friends or alone, most likely, men will notice the group, not the lonely girl." "Nonsense," Nuria snorted. "Besides, maybe I don't want men to notice me. Maybe I came to the bar just to have a drink and unwind after a hard day." "Oh, you're a liar, Nuria," Ariel squinted. "Every woman wants to find a suitable man, her match. No one wants to be alone." Nuria rolled her eyes wearily. "We're speaking different languages, I'm afraid. You'll never understand me." In reality, Nuria never made solitude her priority or the purpose or meaning of her life. Still, she was endlessly irritated by these long-outdated societal notions, society's persistent idea that a woman without a man was incomplete and that she must have been with someone, even if the man was mediocre, just so she wouldn't be alone. After the divorce, Nuria tried to build new relationships several times. She met men at work, on dating websites, in theaters or cafes, and sometimes she even had dates with them, but each time ended in complete failure. Not because the men were necessarily bad, Nuria just couldn't help but mentally compare them to her ex-husband Bruno, and every time, the comparison wasn't in favor of the new suitors. No, the resentment towards Bruno hadn't disappeared, she still felt the pain of how he treated her. However, if you set aside the Natalya and illegitimate children episode, Bruno was practically the perfect husband Nuria had always desired, and now all other men fell short of his standards. After Nuria left 3 years ago, Bruno repeatedly tried to meet her and talk, but Nuria managed to avoid every encounter. "I want a divorce, period," she repeated like a broken record. "I don't need anything from you anymore. Don't call me, and, please, just leave me alone forever." Eventually, losing all hope, Bruno gave in and agreed to divorce. He probably understood that Nuria would never forgive him. They only met once when they came to pick up their divorce certificates. Nuria tried not to even look in her now ex-husband's direction. She was afraid that she wouldn't hold back, burst out, hug him, and start crying. Bruno glanced at her sideways, and when they finally received their divorce certificates, he made a tentative attempt to talk. "Nuria," he began hesitantly, "I miss you." "Stop it," she quickly cutting him off. "Bruno, don't even start. I'm asking you. We are divorced now. From this day on, we are strangers forever." Bruno, immediately deflated, lowered his head, and his gaze dimmed. "As you say," he muttered flatly. "Strangers. I wish you happiness." And he walked away without looking back. For these 3 years, Nuria heard nothing about him and didn't try to find any information. One thing she was sure of, Bruno was happy now with his new wife and 2 biological children. Nuria changed her job, rented an apartment on the opposite side of the city to avoid accidentally encountering the past. One thing she couldn't foresee was that, whether she was hiding or not, the past would eventually catch up with her. On that gloomy autumn day, Nuria decided to dedicate herself to shopping to lift her spirits a bit. Lately, she has become irritable and prone to tears. It's probably just a seasonal vitamin deficiency. Therefore, she decided to visit one of the largest malls in the city to look for a few updates. She hurried past the children's playground, where kids of all ages were happily jumping on trampolines, diving into the ball pit, sliding down slides, and joyfully screaming. Nuria was trying not to look in that direction. Children were still a forbidden topic for her. After all, no matter how you looked at it, her infertility was the reason Bruno started a family on the side. It still hurt to think that she couldn't give her beloved husband the long-awaited child. Her infertility seemed to impose an invisible stamp on her, as if branding her as damaged goods. Even Irasema, her best friend, could inadvertently say something hurtful without realizing it. Nuria would then spend a long time digesting it and recovering. For example, for several weeks now, they had been trying to meet, but Irasema kept postponing the meeting. First from Friday to Saturday, then to Sunday morning, then to the evening. "Listen," Nuria couldn't hold back any longer, "let's finally decide. I'm not obligated to cancel my plans every time and adjust to your convenience. Why do you need to adjust? You don't have kids, you can break away at any moment. But I need to carefully plan and calculate everything, pick up from daycare and school, check homework, and feed. You can't imagine how much a mother has to take care of," Irasema responded contemptuously. "I can't imagine." "You're right," Nuria quietly acknowledged, and Irasema didn't even realize that, thoughtlessly uttering an indiscretion, she unintentionally offended her best friend. In general, Nuria still perceived the topic of children, or rather their absence in her life, too keenly. That's why she was walking past the playground now, trying not to look in that direction, not to see the happy faces with clear eyes and sincere smiles. Suddenly, it seemed to her that she heard crying. Nuria slowed down and listened. Among the children's chatter, laughter, and screams, she heard someone's inconsolable sobbing, interspersed with mournful sniffles. A child was crying, undoubtedly. But where was the child? Nuria turned, trying to find the source of the sound. A few meters from the playground, next to the food court, a little girl, seemingly no older than 2.5 or 3, was crying bitterly. Her light curls were disheveled, her braids unraveled, and the ribbons of her bows were helplessly tangled and hung down. Nuria looked around, trying to find the toddler's parents nearby. There was no one. Undoubtedly, the girl was here completely alone. Possibly she got lost. Nuria decisively approached the girl and sat down in front of her, crouching. "Hey," she said affectionately, "why are you crying?" Rubbing tears with tiny fists on her red, tear-stained face, the girl looked up from under her brows and whimpered. "I got lost." Well, of course, as Nuria thought, the shopping center was huge, and there were many people. It was not surprising that the little girl got lost and panicked. "Did you come here with your parents?" Nuria asked. The girl continued to look at her cautiously. "Dad says I'm not supposed to talk to strangers," she finally declared. "Your dad is absolutely right," Nuria nodded, "so let's immediately get acquainted." "My name is Nuria," she said, "and what's your name?" "Malvina," the girl replied. Nuria couldn't help but smile. "So, Malvina, what happened to you? Where are your mom and dad? Did you come here with them?" "No," the girl shook her head, "I came here with my dad and Alexis." "Is Alexis a boy?" she clarified. "That's my brother," Malvina explained. "I see. So, you came here with your dad and brother. Where are they now?" Nuria continued to ask leading questions. "Alexis needed to go potty," the little girl explained straightforwardly. "Dad took him to the bathroom and told me to wait here." "Have you been waiting long?" The little girl nodded with a mournful sigh, her face showing genuine sorrow mixed with panic. "Yes. Maybe they forgot about me and went home." Nuria shook her head. "I don't think so. How could they forget about such a lovely, beautiful girl? They'll be back soon, for sure." Malvina, sniffling, immediately brightened up. "Your braids are coming undone," Nuria noticed. "Let me fix them for you." The little girl shook her head. "They're not undone," she said carefully. "Daddy just doesn't know how to do them properly." "Ah, so your dad did your hair?" Nuria guessed. "What about your mom?" The girl looked at Nuria with a serious and sad expression. "Mommy died," she said. "Oh my," Nuria gasped. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." The girl sighed deeply. "I want Santa Claus to give me and Alexis a new mommy for the new year. Dad says it's not possible that Santa Claus can only give me a small toy. But I still believe," she added fervently, clenching her fists to her chest. "All right," Nuria nodded with a sigh. "Let's think about how we can find your dad. You don't have a cell phone, of course." "No." Malvina shrugged. "Dad says I'm still too little." "Which makes sense. You don't happen to know his phone number, do you?" The girl shook her head. "Well, do you at least remember your name?" "I said it, my name is Malvina." The little girl frowned angrily, as if annoyed by Nuria's inconsiderate question. "No, I mean the full name. The last name, first name." "I know the last name," the girl nodded. "Malvina Domingo." Nuria involuntarily flinched. Domingo. It used to be her surname, her ex-husband's surname. "And what's your dad's name? Do you remember?" "I remember," Malvina nodded. "Bruno." Nuria couldn't believe her ears. Was it a coincidence? There could be many men with the same name in the world. She squinted at the girl's face, trying to see traces of her ex-husband, and with horror, she found them, the same eye shape, the same eyebrow arch, the same nose shape, the same lip pattern. One would have to be blind not to notice the obvious resemblance. "And your brother Alexis," Nuria suddenly asked with a hoarse voice, "is he your age? Is he as old as you are?" "Yes," Malvina proudly nodded. "We were born on the same day, we are twins," she added with pride. Nuria closed her eyes, haunted by voices and memories. Nuria couldn't get pregnant for years, and this girl got pregnant right away, and with twins. They turned out to be beautiful, lovely, just like their father. Malvina and Alexis, 3-year-old twins, have a father, Bruno. She wanted it to be a coincidence, please. Nuria suddenly stopped breathing. Malvina, you said that your mom passed away? Yes, the girl nodded, a long time ago. I hardly remember her. What was her name? Do you remember? Nuria asked hopefully and at the same time fearfully. Malvina nodded again. Natalya. It was the answer that Nuria had both longed for and, at the same time, was afraid of. Her mom was Natalya, with her gentle face, huge blue eyes, and a soft voice. But before she could fully comprehend it, she heard an excited voice nearby, a voice she wouldn't mistake for anyone else's. Nuria, is that you? She continued to squat in front of the little girl, slowly raising her head, and locked eyes with her beloved eyes. It was the eyes she would recognize from a million, eyes that had hardly changed in 3 years, except for a desperate melancholy that now lived in their depths. Hello, Bruno, Nuria said softly, getting up. Daddy, I knew you would find me. Malvina shouted joyfully, rushing into his arms. Malvina, I told you not to go anywhere from the bench where Alexis and I left you. Bruno scolded, not taking his eyes off Nuria. The little girl looked down. I got bored. I went to look at the fish in the aquarium, then wandered off and forgot where my bench was. I went to look for it and got lost. It's not my fault. She pouted stubbornly. Nuria told me you were looking for me, and you really were. Bruno continued to gaze at Nuria, staring at her as if he couldn't take his eyes off her. She felt uncomfortable under his intense gaze. To cover her embarrassment, she coughed and quietly said, Malvina told me about Natalya. I'm so sorry. Please accept my condolences. Bruno responded with a flat, emotionless voice. Children lost their mother. But you've lost your wife, too, Nuria reminded her hesitantly. Lost your beloved, she almost added before stopping herself. Bruno shook his head and said slowly, looking straight into Nuria's eyes. Natalya and I were never married. She gasped. Why? She asked, although it was none of her business. After all, why should have she cared why they didn't get married? Do they really need it? Many families live together without it. The main thing was that he took responsibility for the children. Because I didn't want to marry her, and I never loved her, Bruno said clearly. But then how? Nuria swallowed a lump in her throat and looked at the twins, who were now chatting happily and laughing together. The children aren't the result of immaculate conception. Bruno ran his fingers through his thick hair, ruffling it nervously. Listen, this is a long conversation, he said. I could have explained everything to you back then, but you never wanted to listen to me then. And indeed, 3 years ago, Nuria had refused to listen to any explanations. She simply ran away from the cruel and hurtful truth. But enough time had passed, and it didn't hurt as much now. Was she ready to hear the truth now? She timidly nodded to her ex-husband. If you still want to tell me the truth, then I'm ready. 10 minutes later, Malvina and Alexis were already sitting at one of the tables in the food court, enthusiastically devouring French fries, pizza, and nuggets with great appetite, all the while chatting animatedly. Bruno and Nuria settled at the adjacent table. They didn't order any food, a piece wouldn't go down their throats. However, Bruno got a cold lemonade for himself and his ex-wife. So, Bruno nervously clenched and unclenched his fingers, and Nuria couldn't help but admire them. She always liked his hands, which were so beautiful and masculine, with muscular forearms, prominent veins, strong palms, and long, powerful fingers. Where should I start? Start from the beginning, Nuria smirked humorlessly. When did you and Natalya start having a relationship? We didn't date, Bruno sharply and angrily retorted. Never. Everything between us was just one night, when I was drunk, I regret to this day. No, he immediately corrected himself. I don't regret having children, but I'll never forgive myself for sleeping with Natalya. I didn't want it. If you didn't want it, you wouldn't have done it, Nuria couldn't resist saying it. Without desire, it's physiologically impossible. Bruno sadly shook his head. I know you won't believe me, but that night, I thought you were with me. Nuria felt as if she had been stabbed in the chest. Why are you doing this to me? She exhaled. It hurts, Bruno. Her ex-husband grabbed her hands abruptly in his and held them tightly. I'm sorry, Nuria, he corrected himself, but I'm not lying. That's the plain truth. I thought you were with me that night. Nuria lightly squeezed his hand, encouragingly. Not that she instantly forgave him for all the pain he caused her, but she understood his feelings. I did fall asleep briefly, Bruno continued confessing, and when I woke up, I found a naked woman's body pressed against me. I thought it was you. Was it Natalya? Nuria asked, trying not to reveal her emotions. It was so unbearable to hear about it. Yes, Bruno nodded. But I only found out in the morning. I was too drunk, it was dark in the room, and she was silent, not saying a word, just caressing me, kissing me, pressing against me, still saying nothing. I immediately started responding to her caresses. I thought I was making love to my wife, Nuria, he added bitterly, to you. Nuria was trying not to cry and asked quietly. How did she enter the house? She had a spare set of keys. My mom left them for her when she went to the sea and forgot to take them back. Natalya knew I would be there, and she also saw that you had left. She decided to take advantage of the opportunity, walked in, saw that I was passed out from drinking, didn't hesitate, immediately undressed, and laid down next to me. The rest is history, he chuckled bitterly. Nuria covered her face with her hands. I was waiting for you then, she struggled to say, all night waiting. I didn't want to go to sleep without you. And you, at that time, were sleeping with someone else. Bruno pleaded with his eyes. Nuria, believe me. In the morning, when I finally saw who was lying next to me, I nearly went crazy. I hated myself for it. I felt ashamed to look you in the eyes. I knew that if you found out, you would never forgive me. Especially since you always said that Natalya had feelings for me and I was the fool. I didn't believe it and didn't notice. Honestly, I was ready to crawl on my knees in front of you, kiss your feet, and beg for forgiveness. It was so terrifying to talk about what happened. It took me a long time to gather the courage, and I kept trying to find the right moment. In short, I just chickened out, he added in desperation. And 3 weeks later, a radiant Natalya told me that she took a pregnancy test, and it was positive, Bruno finished, barely audible, lowering his head. Nuria didn't know what to say. The situation now looked completely different from how she had imagined it. The pain of betrayal didn't diminish, but the circumstances were different. Bruno didn't deceive her intentionally, it just happened. For some reason, she was sure, she felt that her ex-husband wasn't lying, and everything happened exactly as he described. She suddenly remembered how he came home the morning after that night, crying and apologizing, repeating that he was a scoundrel. And she thought he was upset about his mother's illness. Meanwhile, Bruno continued his gloomy narrative. I immediately told Natalya that I didn't love her and would never love her. There could be nothing between us except for that one night. Of course, I had no intention of abandoning my child and promised to financially support and help raise him. I supported Natalya during her pregnancy, took her to doctors for examinations and ultrasounds, bought medications and vitamins, and helped gather baby supplies. Later, it turned out there were 2 children, so everything needed to be purchased in double: diapers, clothes, and toys. A special stroller for twins and a more spacious crib were also necessary. It's so ironic, I dreamed so much about children, but a woman I didn't love and still don't love to this day gave birth to them, Bruno added quietly. Nuria lowered her head, trying to hide her tears. And your mom? When did she find out? Almost immediately, Bruno admitted with a sigh. How could I hide it? They lived in neighboring houses. She soon noticed that I was taking Natalya somewhere and bringing her back. At first, she thought I was having an affair. She gave me a good scolding. My mom couldn't stand when you were around and was ready to kill me for the betrayal. I had to tell her the whole truth and ask her not to expose me. Mom kept insisting that you didn't deserve this. She asked me for forgiveness before she died, Nuria remembered. Now I understand what she meant. I'm a fool. Bruno clenched his head with his hands. I should have told you everything myself, not waiting for others to tell you. That's how it turned out in the end. You somehow learned the truth at the funeral. Did someone from the neighborhood let it slip? Right? Well, sooner or later, it had to happen. I kept silent because I was terribly afraid of losing you, and in the end, I lost you anyway. Nuria looked bitterly at her ex-husband, and her heart was torn apart by pain and pity. God, how she used to love him, and it seemed like that feeling hadn't completely died in her. Yes, Bruno was guilty, very guilty. But she was at fault too. She didn't want to hear his explanation and preferred to just disappear from his life. In the end, whom did she harm the most? Only herself. Or maybe no one, because Bruno never found happiness in her absence. What happened to Natalya? Nuria asked cautiously. Car accident, Bruno explained briefly. She had just gotten her driver's license and wasn't very confident yet. In the end, she lost control of the car during the rain. Thank God, the kids weren't with her in the car. How old were they at that time? Nuria asked. Just turned 1. They, of course, don't remember their mother. As if realizing that the conversation was about them, Alexis and Malvina looked at their father and smiled sweetly. Dad, will there be ice cream? You promised. We'll have ice cream at home, Bruno said sternly, instantly transforming into a caring dad. It's time for you and Alexis to take a nap. Sleep a bit, and then you'll get your ice cream. Wow. Malvina clapped her hands, then looked at Nuria. Can Nuria come to our house? She's nice, the little girl added. Bruno stared at his ex-wife with intensity, his lips barely trembled, and he looked at Nuria as if his entire future depended on her answer. You should ask Nuria herself, he hoarsely said at last. Will you come with us? Malvina asked seriously. Please, we'll have delicious ice cream at home. Nuria finally managed to move her numb lips. It depends on whether you have ice cream in a waffle cone, it's my favorite. I won't go if you don't. We have it, Malvina jumped, smiling joyfully. It's Dad's favorite ice cream too, he always buys it. Well then, Nuria smiled, I'd be happy to come to your house. That New Year, little Malvina's wish came true. Santa Claus gave her and her little brother Alexis a new mom, wonderful, amazing, very loving, and caring, because if you believe in something very strongly and want it, it will certainly come true.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.